Welcome back into The Rundown, a daily podcast where we at CBN News bring you deeper inside the stories we're working on. Today is Monday, July 19th, and I'm Madison Seals, here with a couple of headlining stories this week. There's no question the digital lives we've built are at risk of being hacked. It happens every day in the form of identity theft, personal information leaks, and most disturbingly, major cybersecurity attacks on U.S. industries. But while the U.S. is fixated on securing networks, some experts argue that a major cyber threat could lie within just one piece of hardware manufactured in China. CBN News national security correspondent Caitlin Burke joins me today to highlight a major concern in cybersecurity. Caitlin, the U.S. is focused on securing the networks for our biggest industries, which China has already proven it can bypass. What is another way U.S. infrastructure could be compromised by a foreign hacker?
Right. So especially today, we're hearing about cyber networks. You know, the U.S. and its allies have come out and condemned China, saying that they are participating in cyber espionage. They're hacking our networks. We have released guidelines on their tactics and kind of what cyber defenders can be on the lookout for. But I spoke with an engineer, and he said we are focused in the absolute wrong direction. While the U.S. has its head turned towards cyber networks and defending against cyber attacks, China is actually attacking the very equipment that makes up our critical infrastructure that we rely on them to make. And, you know, we are not focused on protecting that at all. So it's pretty scary stuff.
It seems even more dangerous than a network hack because the equipment is at the core of the U.S. power grid. Is there evidence that some of the Chinese transformers that are currently in our grid today are compromised?
Right. So we rely on China to make all of our specialty steel. And that includes, as you mentioned, the transformers that really are responsible for transporting 60 to 70% of our electricity. And I'm talking about our electric grid, but I just want to clarify real quick. Much of the equipment that is in our electric grid is also in our other critical infrastructure. So China is making specialty parts for everything. But the story that I recently did was specifically about our electric grid. So we go to China to get these huge transformers. And just to give you an idea how big these transformers are, like they are custom made, bespoke, if you will. They are just massive. They have to be shipped in. And we actually had two instances where they came in and then it was really hard to get them to the spot in the grid where we needed them. So one was going to Rhode Island and ended up on the side of the road because it was too heavy. These are like tons and tons. It was too heavy to go over any of the bridges in the state of Rhode Island. Another one came in to a port in California and needed to go to Arizona. And the drive should have taken like 2 to 4 hours, but it actually took 2 weeks because it couldn't fit under the bridges that you see like over a highway along the route. So it had to take this really, really long route. So anyways, you know, these are very important. They're huge. They're very difficult to get. So imagine, you know, it's this big deal to get them here. You finally get one in, you get it into its location, you turn it on to just plug it into the grid and make sure that it works. And then, as an engineer who's, you know, doing all of this, you find something in it that's not supposed to be there. That's exactly what happened. There was a transformer that came in, it was plugged into the grid, the engineers were testing it, and they found a piece of hardware that shouldn't have been there. So we don't really know what happened after that. What we do know is that President Trump immediately passed an executive order banning any more bulk power equipment and some other things from any of our adversaries. And then the next transformer that came in was taken by the Department of Energy to a lab. It never ended up where it was supposed to go, and we never heard anything else about it. So we know that it's serious, but we don't know exactly what was found. The engineer I spoke with said China is messing with the equipment, and basically they have the ability to flip a switch and just totally turn off the lights here.
Well, we learned early on in the COVID pandemic that U.S. reliance on drugs and medical equipment and other things from China could be dangerous. So what effect could a transformer hack have on the U.S., considering that these parts are being made in China?
Right. So after I did this story, I happened to lose power for like 5 hours because of a windstorm. And all I could think about was this interview that I had just done about what China has the ability to do in terms of how long it could take our grid out for. And the example he gave was, he said, a sophisticated hacker can make a cyber attack look like an equipment malfunction. And that's actually exactly what we did to Iran. It's called Stuxnet is the name of the hack and the virus that we kind of put into their nuclear centrifuges. But basically, for a year, this virus was going through their system and just causing it to self-destruct. But it looked like, there was just some sort of engineering issue. And so the people there were trying to figure out what they had done wrong, while the U.S. was taking out a fifth of their nuclear centrifuges. So, I don't think we even fully know the extent of what China could do because we haven't heard enough details about what has been found. But I mean, they can take us out. So we have more than 20 of these large Chinese transformers in our electric grid to date. One of them accounts for 10% of the power going to New York City. Another one, 18 to 20% of the power going to Las Vegas. So if those self-destruct somehow, all of that power is just out. And, I told you about how difficult it is to get these transformers, not to mention that we get the parts from China. So how are we going to get it back on?
Well, after that response, I have a follow-up to my last question, which is, why don't we make our own transformers?
That's a great question. We used to. We used to have specialty steel companies that made all of these important parts. But China basically put all of our companies out of business by dumping, which that term dumping means basically that they flooded the market with such low prices that other companies just couldn't compete. And so, U.S. electric companies had to go with China because they were just bringing such crazy low prices. And, our companies couldn't stay in business and compete with that. So really what it's going to take is funding. Our steel companies need to be funded so that they can afford to make these parts. It's just going to take some of that infrastructure bill money that Biden is pitching to go towards a concerted effort to start making our own parts.
Well, hopefully that's the case. You mentioned Trump's executive order early on. Are there any other efforts, in addition to possibly making our own, to safeguard against Chinese interference with U.S. equipment?
So we know that Trump was taking efforts. We know that he passed that executive order. The hard thing is that he said no one can get bulk power equipment from any of our adversaries. But as I mentioned, we don't make that bulk power equipment. And so our companies are still being forced to go overseas. So we know that efforts were starting to be made. It's unclear what Biden's infrastructure bill will focus on. He talks a lot about renewable energy. And, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's so much focus on protecting our networks. And it's just alarming that no one is talking about all the equipment that's already in our grid that could be compromised. So hopefully there's some efforts happening that we just don't know about yet, but I can tell you there's not enough. And again, Joe Weiss, the engineer I spoke with, he said that we also need to see training happening. We need engineers who understand how all this equipment operates to be trained on cybersecurity. And we need our cybersecurity defenders to be trained on how the equipment operates, because we don't want to fall victim to an attack and not know we're under attack. Years and years ago, back in 2012, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta warned about something he called a cyber Pearl Harbor. And, you know, the scary thing is that what he's describing is what we seem to be very close to experiencing now. And he said, you know, it will cause a profound sense of vulnerability that will paralyze and shock the nation. And, you know, I just hope that we will start protecting against the right things before we understand what it is to be truly vulnerable.
Well, this is definitely an interesting twist on the cybersecurity story, and you can check out more details on the CBN News website. I'll be right back with another top story from this week after the break. Thanks for joining me, Caitlin.
Thanks, Madison.
CBN News provides a faith-based perspective on the most important stories of the day. But it takes time, hard work, and resources. Will you help us continue to be a voice for truth in the media? Visit cbnnews.com/give now. And thanks for listening.
Another top story this week. During a year of pandemic deaths, there was another silent killer on the rise, and you can find it in nearly every drug on the street. An opioid called fentanyl is responsible for the worst year on record for drug-related deaths. CBN News medical reporter Lori Johnson joins me today to talk about this toxic drug, why it's on the rise, and what you can do to protect yourself. Lori, for those of us who don't know much about drugs, why is fentanyl so dangerous?
Well, mostly because just the tiniest amount can kill a person. So right then and there, that's the problem. Little teeny tiny amounts are being added into just about everything that people buy on the streets. And a lot of people have no intention and don't want any fentanyl in their street drugs, but it's in there anyway, and sometimes it contains amounts that kill people. We've had more drug overdoses last year than ever before, and most of the drug overdoses involved fentanyl, and almost all of them were accidental, meaning they were not suicide. People didn't mean to die. They just didn't realize there was fentanyl in the drugs they were taking, or they didn't realize there was so much of it. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, and it's about 100 times stronger than heroin. It's about 100 times stronger, more powerful than morphine. So again, just a couple grains of sand worth of fentanyl can kill a person. As a matter of fact, when police go to a crime scene where there's an overdose or other drug-related crime, a lot of times they have to wear hazmat equipment because there's fentanyl around, and the police sometimes are getting fentanyl on their skin or ingesting it accidentally and having overdoses from it. So it's extremely dangerous, and it is extremely prevalent in all street drugs, all drugs that you buy that are buy illegally.
So is this killer opioid just on the streets, or is it found in prescription drugs as well?
Well, that's a great question. It is found in prescription drugs that you buy on the street. So if you're getting a prescription from your doctor and you take it to your regular pharmacy, don't worry about it. There's not fentanyl in those drugs. Those drugs are highly regulated and very safe. But unfortunately, a lot of people buy prescription drugs on the streets from dealers on the streets. And a lot of these people are nice people. They never meant to get addicted to drugs. You know, a lot of people become addicted to opioids and painkillers when they've had surgery or they've had some other kind of pain, and their doctor prescribes them a painkiller, and that's fine. But a lot of times people get addicted to those painkillers and they want more of the prescription, and the doctor says, no, I'm cutting you off. And those people are addicted to painkillers, and so they start buying them on the street from dealers who say, yeah, I've got some oxycodone, I've got some Vicodin, I've got some Tramadol that I can buy. And it's just like the kind that you get in the pharmacy, but they're lying to you. It's actually oftentimes laced with fentanyl and can kill you. As a matter of fact, that's how Prince, the music star Prince died. He became addicted to painkillers. You remember how he used to perform, and he got a knee injury one time, and he became addicted to painkillers, and then his doctor wouldn't write him anymore after a while, and so he started buying painkillers illegally off the streets, and he thought he was taking a Vicodin, and actually it had fentanyl in it and killed him.
And I remember when that story made the news because it shocked so many people who followed him and didn't think that he had any previous issues with drugs at all. And I think that just shows how dangerous this one is. You don't have to be addicted to drugs in general. It just takes a tiny bit of this to really mess up your system.
It really does. And so, for example, Molly or ecstasy, this is a pill called MDMA that, people go to college, they want to have a good time. They might go to a concert or whatever. And, these so-called party pills, they're not what they tell you they are. If somebody says, hey, let's do Molly, hey, let's do E, that's what they call ecstasy. A lot of times these drugs are now laced with fentanyl, with deadly amounts of fentanyl, and can kill you. So don't, of course, the first recommendation is don't ever do drugs that you buy on the street illegally, but some people might. So the second, recommendation and second thing you should know is if you ever do drugs illegally, they may be laced with deadly amounts of fentanyl, and it could kill you. That message needs to be sent out because so many people are dying this way.
Right. As you said, I think the obvious approach to drugs is to stay away entirely. But for those who are taking drugs that have this in them, or I guess for those users who choose to take fentanyl, how can they protect themselves from overdosing?
Well, there are a couple ways to do it. There are these new things called fentanyl test strips. And what they do is you can take any drug and you can test it with these test strips to see if there's any fentanyl in it. So right now, the police are handing out these fentanyl test strips to people who they come in contact with who, have overdosed and survived, or people they know who are known drug users. They say, here, take these fentanyl test strips. And, obviously you need to get into treatment, but until you do, you can use these to test the drugs that you're taking to see if there's any fentanyl in them. And other people can send away for them. People can go to cbnnews.com, and there are a couple websites there where you can send away for these fentanyl test strips. So basically, let's say, using an example that I just gave you a minute ago, let's say you want to do this drug Molly. And what you do is you crush it up, and you put a little bit of water with it, and then you stick the test strip in it. It'll say yes or no whether there's fentanyl in it. And then another thing, aside from the fentanyl test strips, is called Narcan. Again, we've got a lot of parents and grandparents and people who live with users, and they're scared to death that they're going to die of an overdose, and they're trying to get them into treatment, but, for the time being, they might not be willing to go into treatment. This stuff called Narcan stops a person from dying after they have overdosed. And this drug called Narcan, you just squirt it up their nose. It's a spray when somebody is actively overdosing. And you can buy this stuff called Narcan at any pharmacy, and you do not need a prescription. So if you are going to do drugs, again, not a good idea, but if you are going to do drugs, do it with someone else and make sure that somebody has Narcan so that if somebody overdoses, you can use the Narcan and stop the overdose, stop somebody from dying, and then call 911. Another thing people who are using should look out for is, like, let's say you're buying prescription drugs on the street. Beware if the vial, the container, doesn't have a label on it, or if the pills inside don't look the same. That's another big red flag.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, I think this information will be applicable to a lot of people. As you mentioned earlier, the number of fentanyl deaths were on the rise during the pandemic. And I know that still is a very difficult year for a lot of people. Everybody copes with difficult situations differently. But I have to ask, do you think that the two were related?
Absolutely. I spoke with someone who runs a drug rehabilitation facility, and he said that a lot of people who were recovering from drug abuse, they were on the straight and narrow, they were clean, they relapsed because they weren't able to go to their meetings, or they didn't get, involved in Zoom meetings with their Al-Anon or their Narcanon or whatever meetings, because support groups are essential for people who are in recovery. And a lot of times people kind of fell away, and isolation is the absolute worst thing if you are some sort of an addict. Also, being cooped up with family members is a trigger for a lot of people who use. And just having your routine messed up can also be a trigger for people who use. So all of those things were really bad for people who were sort of on the edge, kind of tipped them over. But this person I spoke to said, get into recovery. Recovery works. There are so many different recovery places around. You can call Narcanon. You can call your local public health facility. You can talk to your own doctor. You can just go online and just search drug rehab, and a bunch of them will come up, and just go get your foot in the door and start looking at rehabs. There are all different kinds. The man I talked to said he likes the 12-step programs the best because they are Christ-centered. One of the steps is to admit that you are powerless against drugs, and that you do have a higher power in God and in Jesus. And I've interviewed so many people who have recovered from heroin and other drugs through the power of Jesus. So it can be done. If you've tried rehab before, try again. Sometimes it takes people to go to 1, 2, or 3 different rehabs before it clicks.
Well, that's great info to be aware of, and it's a great reminder to watch out for our friends and family and stick to prescription drugs from our pharmacies. That's all on this story for today, but you can check out more details on the CBN website. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Madison, for having me. Take care now.
That's all for now, but if you're enjoying the CBN News Daily Rundown, check out the CBN News app. As certain voices are censored and free speech platforms are shut down, downloading it will ensure you keep receiving news from a Christian perspective. We'll meet you back here Wednesday. Have a great week.